Up next on Book TV, John Stossel contends that the government and politicians, regardless of political affiliation, are incapable of addressing the political and social issues facing the U.S. The author, host of Fox Business Network's Stossel, argues that Americans need to think as individuals and stop looking to the government for assistance. This is just under an hour.
Thank you all for coming. I'm Larry Moten, the president. We're delighted to provide a forum for our good friend John Stossel to talk about his new book, No They Can't, Why Government Fails But Individuals Succeed. And here to introduce John today is his colleague and intellectual collaborator, Judge Andrew Napolitano. As you all know, Judge Napolitano is a Fox News senior judicial analyst, providing daily analysis on the Fox News and Fox Business channels. The judge is the youngest life-tenured Superior Court judge in the history of the state of New Jersey, serving on the bench from 1987 to 95. He also served as an adjunct professor of constitutional law at Seton Law School for many years, and he has published 6 books on government and the law, and they're all terrific, by the way. His latest book, published last fall, is titled, It is Dangerous to Be Right When the Government is Wrong. Great titles. The Case for Personal Freedom. Please join me in welcoming a true champion of economic and individual liberty, Judge Andrew Napolitano.
My friend Voltaire suggested that title. It's nice to be here. The young lady with whom I'm seated said they're going to make you sing for your lunch, so you better do a good job in introducing this character, Stossel. This character, Stossel, and I first met, he probably doesn't remember this, in 1969 when I was a freshman and he was a senior, not at the institution after which this place is named, but at the one up the block, the colors of which are black and orange. We were students at Princeton together. Now, John had long hair, was running a newspaper, a left-wing rag called the Daily Princetonian, and was wearing a T-shirt that said, "Burn it down, baby." That's all right. I had a crew cut. I was wearing a T-shirt that said, "Bomb Hanoi." Since then, the two of us have answered that siren call of human freedom and have devoted our careers to the defense of it. I had the privilege of doing so on the bench in the Superior Court in New Jersey and in New Jersey's and New York City's courtrooms. John has done so on television like no other person has. John, as you know, is the recipient of 19 Emmys. Most of my colleagues would kill to have one. John has 19. Why does he have 19 Emmys? Because he is intellectually honest, utterly steadfast, and always on top of his game. I'm going to give you a little example. The other day, I was at Princeton University listening to a speech by George Will. He was comparing the presidencies of the two Princetonians who became president, Woodrow Wilson and James Madison. You can imagine which one he favored, thank goodness. Seated next to me is a woman that keeps poking me in the ribs every time Will says something that blasts Wilson or praises Madison. At the end of the speech, she says to me, you should tell Stossel that he should come down here and do one of his shows at Princeton. There'd be 1,000 students screaming to hear him. And I said to her, really? She said, yes, look, when you and Stossel were students here, maybe you were the only two libertarians, but that's not the case now. I'm thinking to myself, is this some nut job or is this some lady that I should know who she is talking about Stossel like this? I said, by the way, madam, my name is Andrew Napolitano. She said, yes, I know who you are. I'm Shirley Tillman, the president of Princeton University. So there's your invitation, John. One day I was getting a little carried away on air. One day I was getting carried away on air. And I used a phrase that I really believe in. I know there are arguments on the other side, and I know not everybody in this room will agree with me, but I happened to utter the phrase, taxation is theft. Oh, John calls me up and goes, Judge, you're killing me. I said, what do you mean I'm killing you? He said, when you say something like taxation is theft, my inbox is filled with emailers saying, why don't you say that kind of stuff? John is a champion of human freedom was the gift of explaining it in a way that everybody can understand and nobody can find him disagreeable. The other day I was looking at a piece of literature, something from Reason, advertising some speech that I'm going to be giving in November. And there was a picture in this Reason publication of John Stossel just about 2 or 3 months ago playing volleyball on a beach in California with a bunch of 19-year-olds. Now, if you blinked your eyes 3 times, you couldn't tell which of them was, fill in the blank, John's age, and which of them was the 19-year-old. There are times when I look at him and I say, that's what I want to look like when I grow up. I know when I was on the bench, I used to say, that's what I want to be like when I grow up. And now I can say, he is the man I admire most. He is my friend, my colleague, and my mentor, John Stossel.
Wow, Andrew, thank you. That is very kind. And I should say I interviewed him for my first TV special when I was nervously branching out in your direction. And he was so quiet and careful and timid that we couldn't use it. He's changed since then. He is far more brilliant on the principles of liberty than I in terms of the law. I come at it as a consumer reporter, not from really understanding it, but just seeing how life worked and approach the economic side of it. And that's what No They Can't is about. And by the way, you say that people at Fox would love to get Emmys. They don't give Emmys to people at Fox. Emmys are garbage. They give them to socialist reporters who bash business. That's how I won those 19 Emmys. Then I wised up. Then I stopped winning any Emmy awards. The No They Can't on the cover of my book is a play off of the last election campaign where there was all that excitement about the magic politician who said, yes, we can. And the intensity of that was extraordinary. And frankly, it's all great if we means free people, but we in their minds, and in many people's minds, has come to mean the state. And this is really a bad idea. But as I've come to learn, it's intuitive that maybe you understand life doesn't work that way, but to most people, I mean, there's all this polling information. People don't trust government. Congress has a 12% approval rating. That may be true, but the next time the crisis happened, people's instinctive reaction is that government's got to do something. I mean, think about after September 11th. We have to take over airport security. Tom Daschle said you can't professionalize if you don't federalize. It was instinctive. People were scared. The screeners had let these people go through. In fact, they had obeyed all the FAA rules. The small knives they brought on and the box cutters were legal. The unlocked cockpit doors, that was all legal. But nevertheless, they were minimum wage workers often and private profit-seeking contractors. People viewed that as a risk. And so now we get the TSA. And how's that working out for us? So you know your experience with it. I didn't realize the extent of it. It goes well beyond that. How much more do they spend than the private screeners? Not twice as much, 10 times as much they now spend. And in the law, they put in a part that said, if your city wants to opt out and go back to the system that Israel uses and Europe uses and most of the world uses, which is private contractors competing under government supervision, which of course is better because they have to compete, and you can fire them if they're bad. You can't fire the government. It creates some flexibility. If you want to do that, just ask the TSA, and you can. And a couple places have. Kansas City, the largest is San Francisco. So we go to San Francisco to shoot, and we interview people, and they say things like, gee, these screeners are nicer. And the line moves more quickly. And TSA undercover studies have found that they are much more likely to catch contraband in San Francisco than the government screeners are. And why is that? Do we look into it? Well, it's a private contractor who knows he has to work hard to keep the job. And he does all kinds of innovative experiments. They run contests where the best screener can win $2,000. Who can find the contraband fastest? Who can pack the bag most quickly? They then, to keep the airports happy so they get hired next year, they shift screeners around so the line keeps moving. So all these other airports want to get these private screeners, which is legal under the law, and they apply for permission to the TSA. The TSA ignores them for a year, doesn't even respond. And finally, a few months ago, they say, we don't think this would be advantageous to the federal government. That's the new standard. Not how can we move people along, how can we keep people safe, what's advantageous to us. The bureaucracy has built an empire, and its goal is to keep itself going. This is what happened. This is not intuitive when people shout, yes, we can. Now, I've learned this the hard way. I was a consumer reporter on the left, cheering on government regulation. I became a libertarian when I finally saw it did not work. You were smarter about this than I, but it's not intuitive. We really have to work hard to explain this to people. We're not wired to understand that a free society can solve complex economic problems. We grew up in a family. We're programmed to believe that mommy and daddy know best and should plan for us. Our ancestors grew up in tribes where if you didn't obey the tribal leader and harvest the fruit at the right time, you died and you didn't give birth to us. We're programmed to follow the leader. The mechanism where Adam Smith showed us how the invisible hand could do this better just doesn't, maybe it makes sense to you, but it doesn't make sense to most Americans. I do these pieces which try to explain it to people, and Andrea Rich, who's sitting over here, runs a charity that gives them to high school students so we can at least introduce these ideas. And I hope you will support her or give her your card. But it's an uphill climb. And I see this again and again. I mean, one example of the success of private markets is in South America. I mean, of the basket case that is Central and South America, one country is doing quite well. That's Chile. And the biggest reason is because this guy named Jose Piñera, the finance minister, created private Social Security accounts. So instead of trusting the government to give you money, everybody has a little savings book, and they can watch the money appreciate it. It makes them think about their own money and investment. And through this simple innovation, Chile has prospered. And I give President Bush credit. He wasn't the best speaker, but he went to most every state trying to sell that in America and got nowhere because people here are horrified by the idea. So I go to Chile and expect to find people who will say, hey, this is great. But everybody I interview, nobody says that. Everybody says, oh, you know, the bank that administers this, the fee is too high, and government ought to step in and reduce income inequality. Nobody understood the mechanism that had made their lives better. I mean, this is also true in Hong Kong. Milton Friedman's famous example of the most popular high school video that Andrea gives out is one that says, is America number one? I ask students, why is America prosperous? And they think for a while, and they think, oh, it's because we're a democracy. And I say, well, India's a democracy, and India's poor. Well, India's overpopulated. Actually, the population density of India is the same as that of New Jersey, which is doing okay. They say, well, America has natural resources, but so does India. And we can say, well, what about Hong Kong? It doesn't have democracy. It doesn't have natural resources, yet it got rich. They went from third world to first world in just 50 years. They're as rich as we are. Why is that? They don't know, but of course it's because of economic liberty. And now we have these Heritage and Freedom House polls that compare countries by economic freedom, and the places that are free are the best places to live. But this is not intuitive. And when I went to Hong Kong, I tried to open a business in New York. It took me months. In Hong Kong, I could open one in one day. And that's why they're prosperous. But when I asked people, they didn't know. They made the same comments the people in Chile made. Oh, yeah, the government should step in and fix this problem and fix that problem. And Chile reminds me, I know all of you are reading the New York Times less or have canceled your subscriptions, and I applaud you for that. But I read it because I really feel I have to know what my neighbors and my former ABC colleagues are worshiping. And did you see this, the Sunday magazine this week? This was the cover here. And a big story was this one. They made her an icon, which is impossible to live up to. So this is a story about a movement in Chile where they have some private schooling. They're doing quite well, but there is inequality. And because there is inequality, people are very upset. And so they're having occasional riots about why isn't college free? And the president of Chile, Sebastián Piñera, the younger brother of Jose now, had a good answer, I thought. He said he defended Chile's educational system by calling education a consumer good. And he went on to say that we would all like education and health care and many other things to be free. But when all is said is done, when all is said and done, nothing in life is free. Someone has to pay. Seems reasonable. Education isn't free. This was a hugely popular president. Remember, the miners were rescued. His popularity ratings were through the roof. And then these protests started. Now, part of the problem is that the people on our side look like, well, look around you. And the people on the other side look like her. She's the one being profiled in the New York Times, a 23-year-old communist with a nose ring. And she is popular now. Sebastián Piñera is not. She's winning in this debate. She answered him saying someone has to pay by saying, of course someone has to pay. But why not the state? Through taxes on large corporations and the nationalization of resources. That just feels good to people. It sounds good. She went on to say, entrepreneurs had speculated and grown wealthy off the dreams and expectations of thousands of young people in Chilean families. Piñera's popularity ratings, which were way up, are now at 22%, the lowest of any Chilean president in history. The student movement popularity is 72%. Now, part of it's because she's young and good-looking, but most of it is because these ideas just make sense to people. They are intuitive. The idea that our brains are going to do economic reasoning just fights the way we were wired. We're not wired to reason out how impersonal market forces solve problems. And nobody goes to the streets to celebrate these marginal improvements that constantly happen. But it's economic freedom that works. Now, here too at the Manhattan Institute you fight this. I want to branch off to one of my other areas where you have really led. Peter Huber talked about this. He says, in law school we're taught that you can manage life through paper and procedure. And that makes sense to people. And hence, the tort bar has made themselves so rich. Because they set up the assumption that they will compensate the victims who are injured by you greedy corporate sellers of risky products, and they will deter you from doing it again. And this just makes sense to people. Big companies selling drugs that hurt somebody, somebody has to pay. The drug company should have put up more warnings. It's, as you've heard here, it's such a horrible system. They say, who but we will compensate the victims? Well, there are lots of ways to compensate the victims. You can do it through government. You can do it through private charity. But this system is an awful way to do it because most of the money goes to the middlemen. I mean, you say, what do you mean most of the money? The tort bar only takes 30 or 40%, but you add in the defense costs and the court costs, 70% of the money almost goes to the middlemen. And it takes people 10 years to get paid. And then the wrong people get paid. A Harvard study in New York found in medical malpractice cases, most people who got paid were not victims of malpractice. And most who were victims didn't get anything. And yet this is the tort system that dominates in America and allows these guys to buy private jets and to kill product innovation. They even interfere with the information flow that helps free people protect themselves. When you fire someone now in your business, do you ever, and somebody calls up and says, you fired this guy, why? And let's say you fired him because he's lazy and reckless. You don't tell the company B that he's lazy and reckless, because your human resources department will say, are you crazy? You'll get a labor lawsuit. And you'll spend $100,000 just defending what was your good decision. So you just say, we agreed to part company. So American doesn't even tell Delta when they fired a pilot because he was a drunk. This makes us less safe. And while, again, it's so intuitive to say we should have more labels on everything to remind people that this can be risky, you know, what's the result? Ever look at a birth control pill label? I happen to have one here.
How's that working?
Pretty well. I've yet to give birth. So how does this make us safer? This is what lawyers bring us. It's tiny fine print. And it's true, if you read this, you wouldn't want the pill anymore. They don't make us safer. They make us poorer. They deprive us of innovation. Would you refold this for me? But they win because intuition is on their side. Yes, we can make you safe. Capitalism performs miracles all the time, leaving people alone. I mean, we've lifted more people out of the mud and misery of poverty through markets in the third world than ever before. Nobody in America notices. People here say, why isn't education free? The Occupy Wall Street protest down there, they want more. We take it for granted that supermarkets have 30,000 products, and they rarely poison anybody, and all the products are cheap. We take it for granted that I can go to a foreign country, stick a piece of plastic in the wall, and cash will come out. And I can give that same piece of plastic to a total stranger, and he'll rent me a car for a week. And when I get home, Visa or MasterCard will have the accounting correct to the penny. The government, by contrast, can't even count the votes accurately. And yet, Obama was elected partly on the message, we're going to fix health care. I mean, Obamacare, by the time it passed, may not have been popular, but most people in the country wanted the government to do something about health care. And health care really isn't a free market even before Obamacare. It's already been messed up by all the government steps that encourage people to buy insurance that somebody else pays. But the results are already out there, and they're already awful. A couple of years ago, the Detroit Medical Center announced proudly that it was using barcodes to use computers to electronically keep track of all its patients and all their medical records and the drugs they took. And yay, isn't this great? But think about it. Supermarkets did that 40 years ago. I mean, Coke and Pepsi is obviously less important than our medical records. But it took 40 years of insanity before we brought this to the system where insurance companies and government is pulling the strings. Friedrich Hayek said, the curious task of economics is to teach man how little he understands about what he thinks he can design. That's what I hope to do with No, They Can't. It's a big battle. I thank you for fighting it. Clearly, leaving people free is what makes us prosperous. And economists tend to focus on the prosperous part of that statement. That's not the most important one. The free part is. It sounds vague, but it's just as important because individuals and their freedom matter. It's a moral objection to big government to say it leaves us less free, because if control over our own lives is diminished, if we can't tell the mob or even our neighbors to leave us alone, we are not just free, we are not just less free, we are less. Big government makes us all smaller. I thank you for fighting against that.
So John will answer questions. We have the mic. It's a big room, so all I'd ask you to do, I'll let John field the questions, but please wait for the microphone to get to you and tell us who you are so that we can all hear. All right, thank you.
And I would just let you ladies do the mic, so then we go quickly back and forth, and you pick whoever you.
People with their hands up, you can question.
Thank you very much for not only this talk, but for all your entertaining and educational talks on TV. As a lawyer who has represented corporations in actions of the type you talked about, in firing people and other things, I can say that unfortunately you're being a piker in saying that it would only cost $100,000 of legal fees. What I want to do is ask you this question. I tell you I'm a conservative, not a libertarian. And I've always wondered what you would say in answer to the question, because you constantly on television and elsewhere speak against government intervention in various things. Where does libertarianism end and anarchy begin? How do we avoid, which I assume you would want to avoid, anarchy, and yet have freedom for people?
Well, I think the founders had it pretty good. This is the Constitution. It's much thinner than what we have now, but basically, that you should be allowed to, libertarians say people should be allowed to do anything that's peaceful, which means there's a role for government to make sure I don't kill you or hurt you or take your stuff. And this libertarian would go further. Others would say the tort system would handle pollution, but I'm happy to have government to have pollution control rules. And like Hayek, I'm happy to have government have a limited social safety net. But that's about it, and that's all we need. And America grew fastest during our first 150 years when government was less than 5% of the economy. Now it's 40% and growing. Under 5% would be good.
Hi. I saw your program last night.
You have to introduce yourself, Larry says.
Okay. My name is Bob Weisberg. I'm a sometime professor of political science. Enjoy your programs. Now, last night when I was watching the program, you had something on Head Start, and you showed that Head Start was a failure. Now, that's been known almost from the day Head Start was created. Because
I didn't know.
I knew. You should have called me up. Okay. By law, Head Start has to be evaluated every year, and those evaluations are then stockpiled in some government basement. Now, my question is this. Are you really think that Head Start is about helping young children become smarter, or is it really a make-work job program? And many of what you're talking about, airport security, Head Start, all these terrible programs are not really terrible when it comes to making government jobs, and that's their real purpose. So how would you respond to the fact that governments call their programs all sorts of things, but many of them are nothing more than job creation things, and by those measures, they're very good.
They are, and that's what they become. But I'm less cynical than you. I really think the people behind these programs think they're going to work. And Head Starts was a good example. How could it not work? Again, intuitively, it just has to work. You have our kids, we read to them, most have two parents, they're going to have a Head Start, obviously. Why not in a rich country spend some government money? They've spent about $180 billion so far to give the truly needy a little head start, pre-kindergarten, some caring teachers, and then when they start school, they won't be as far behind. But then finally, as you say, the government evaluates the program. They compare the kids later. And it wasn't just that by high school there was no difference. There was no difference. They couldn't tell who had Head Start and who didn't. By the next year, by first grade, it was all gone if there was ever anything there. So just as in a reasonable world, the TSA would say, oh my goodness, the private screeners do a much better job for 1/3 the money. We'll get out of this business and turn it back to what Europe and Israel do. But they don't do that. And Head Start just spent more money after they found it was not accomplishing its goal. They only grow.
Hi, thank you for coming today and all the work that you do. My name is Tom Delzell. I work in the commercial real estate investment sales of retail properties. one thing that we see in our sector, I'm just curious if you've seen it, is the Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board, which manages all of the Social Security money that comes in from the Canadian government. They're pouring billions over the border into the U.S. economy. Bush, you brought that up, Bush tried to privatize our Social Security. This, to me, would seem like a tremendous winner for a candidate, be it Romney, because it would appeal to the younger generation, which has no faith in it. It would appeal to our investors. It would probably appeal to union workers in construction, because if Canadians can perhaps spend $30 billion a year in investments, would be spending a structural, permanent $300 billion, roughly, being 10 times bigger. Are you aware of CPPIB? And
I am not. I'm struck by that. Boy, you Canadians don't publicize your successes very well.
I'm a good old American, but I see that money coming in, and I'll be happy to share some more information with you on it, that you can do a show on it.
I mean, Canada is an unusual success story in many ways, and that we think of Canada as that socialist country with government-run single-payer health care. But on the economic freedom indices these days, they're ahead of the United States. About 20 years ago, a liberal government saw that they were on the track to go broke, as we are now, and they cut government spending, not cut it from the way the Washington types cut it from what they wanted to spend next year. They cut actual spending. They did raise taxes, but they cut $6 for every $1 in taxes they raised. They have no Fannie and Freddie. They have a slightly higher rate of home ownership without that. They've done well in many ways, and the Canadian dollar, which was then worth 70 cents, is now worth about $1. So they have done better.
Robert James, I'm a businessman here. The government and Republicans and Democrats both want to have the United States be the world's policeman. That's the way they're all working on that assumption. Now, if you were to ask everybody around here, you'd probably find 80% of the people who say, no, we should not be the world's policeman.
In this room, I think this room's pretty hawkish, but maybe you're right.
I think you'd find they aren't. But that doesn't make any difference. Most people look back and say, Iraq, that's not too good an idea. Afghanistan, we ought to get out. That was a big mistake. Most of the world's policemen think we've done, there was some question about them. So, this is different than economics. But do you have a comment on it?
I mean, I do. I have a chapter on defense in No They Can't, and I start by saying I'm really uncomfortable writing this chapter because I'm surrounded at Fox by all these smart people who have studied defense and war and diplomacy all their lives, and they say we need to be in all these places. But government, which has failed at everything it's done that I've looked at, why would we assume it would be good at policing the world? And we now still have 50,000 soldiers in Germany. I thought we won that war. And 30,000 in Japan, 30,000 in South Korea, all left over from the Cold War. And Eisenhower's military-industrial complex does live on. There are these people who say if we don't do it, the world will be a much less safe place. But I look at what the Department of Homeland Security does and how they waste money, and I just don't believe it. I think we could do much less. We should attack people who attack us. We should not be isolationists. That's how people who say this get smeared. There's nothing isolationist about it. We should trade with other people. We should write books that torment the mullahs and distribute them in those countries. But to say we can police the world, we can't afford it, A, and B, it makes more enemies.
Yeah, Mark Skousen, editor of Forecasts and Strategies and producer of Freedom Fest. John, I've watched a lot of your shows, and it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that more and more, when you confront the government agencies with these, after you've told the story of how ridiculous X, Y, and Z is, then you say, and we asked the government agent to respond to this, and they refused to comment. Are you finding this happening more and more to you or less and less? Are government people or whoever, are they willing to talk to you? What's been your experience now that you've moved to Fox News?
Fewer of them. I mean, when I was at ABC, some of them would see ABC and see, oh, big government lovers, and they would talk. And once they see Fox, they just rarely want to talk. It's just, but you know, the corporations are no better. Most of them didn't want to talk either when you had some bad news about them.
Michael Myers, Executive Director of the New York Civil Rights Coalition. John, you said that the founders had it right, but the founders talked about...
Okay, they didn't have that part, the slavery part right. They had most of it right.
Let me ask my question. The founders had we the people, and we the people amended the Constitution. We the people, not the government. We the people amended the Constitution, provide for the 14th Amendment, which include the Equal Protection Clause. We amended the Constitution, provide for women the right to vote. And the elected representatives of the people passed the 1964 and 1965 Civil Rights Acts, which provided for equality of treatment with respect to public accommodations so that everyone would be expanded in terms of the notion of freedom. So my question to you is, would you repeal either the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause? Would you repeal the 1964 Civil Rights Act and or the 1965 Civil Rights Act?
All right, why don't you just give the mic to your right to Andrew Napolitano to answer most of that question for me. Really, give him the mic. I would say, I'll start it off. I'll start it off by saying, by being provocative enough to say, yes, I would repeal the 2 of the 11, I forget, parts of the Civil Rights Act that said I, as a private citizen, don't have the right to discriminate. I say, as adults, we should have a sphere of privacy around us, and if I want to hire only Koreans or only one-armed people, that should be my right. And the Civil Rights Act, which was right to prevent government discrimination, and most of the horrors of our history were government discrimination, government legalized slavery, government imposed Jim Crow, was right to get rid of that. It's not right to tell private citizens with whom they can associate with. But seriously, Andrew, you want to add to that? I would say just let him, because he's more knowledgeable and he represents the libertarian point of view on this stuff better than I.
I don't think I could say it any better than you did, John. And
all right,
look,
well, then sit
the
down.
whole purpose of the 14th Amendment was to assure that the disabilities visited on the federal government by the 5th Amendment would be visited on the states. Disabilities meaning the state can't discriminate on the basis of race. But there's nothing in there about private discrimination. So the 14th Amendment is the linchpin to freedom. Otherwise, we'd have 50 tyrannies in the 50 state governments. The 14th Amendment is to be lauded by those who believe in freedom. But the Civil Rights Act telling you who can come onto your private property, that's a step the founders never contemplated. I would repeal the part that regulates private behavior, not the part that regulates public behavior. Jim Crow had to go, and Jim Crow began to go when unelected judges, thankfully, gave us Brown versus Board of Education. But that was public schools, government schools.
If I run a hotel and I want to keep you out, I want to just have a white person's hotel, and the market would correct for that, because I would boycott that hotel, and lots of people would, and the market would sort that out better than law will. Yes, sir.
I look at the assets that are deployed by the other side, which include most of the media and the whole educational establishment, and then you add demographics to that increasing numbers of people are getting transfer payments, which intuitively none of them want to give up. And I wonder if we shouldn't apply the title of your book, No, We Can't, to our side in this argument. So I'm hoping you can cheer me up a little bit, because I get very despondent sometimes.
Yeah, I'm not good at cheering people up on that. Thomas Jefferson did say it's the natural progress of things for government to grow and liberty to yield. But look at the stuff that's happened in spite of that. Some of it thanks to this group. I never thought welfare would ever be repealed. I mean, who could be against that? And then Charles Murray wrote Losing Ground, and just that idea, losing ground, changed the way people think about things, and how many people have gotten off welfare, have found jobs because of that. Look at how capitalists produce so many good things. I mean, when I said, no, they can't, I left out of my speech, and I shouldn't, that doesn't mean that we can't. And we, through our clubs and charities and entrepreneurs pursuing profit, have given us cell phones and air conditioning and food and music and travel that only kings and queens once had, all through the private sector, through the animal spirits of capitalism that seems to overcome this trend. Also, as the transfer payments get uglier, it will get uglier first in other places, in Greece and Japan, where there are more people our age. And they will blow up first, and maybe we'll learn from that. And look what Steve Malaga did, as I look at him over there. States are suddenly paying attention to their bankrupt pension funds and have woken. This is too boring, I thought, when someone first presented me with these ideas. State pension funds and their deficits. You know, tonight on Fox News, no one's going to watch that. And yet, states are now, this is now in the news. So I'm optimistic about that, yeah.
John,
Heather.
those of us who are in the business of trying to persuade people about the importance...
Heather, you have to say who you are first.
I'm Heather. I'm Heather Higgins. I run the Randolph Foundation and Independent Women's Forum and Independent Women's Voice. Those of us who are in the business of trying to persuade people fully recognize that this is an intellectual argument and not an emotional one, and therefore much harder, much less intuitive to make. But you yourself have transitioned from, you know, being sympathetic to the arguments of the left to the right, and I'm sure you have many people who have come to you over time saying that they too have had the same epiphany. And I'm wondering if you can tell us, what are some of those arguments and observations that led them to have those transitions in how they thought that are perhaps entree points for us to make inroads?
Well, I changed because as a reporter, I cheered on regulation, watched it fail, and then discovered Reason magazine. I know of no one who took the same path. I have many times asked the same question of people, and the most common answer I've gotten is that I believed in that until I started a business or tried to start a business and was faced with the taxes and the regulation. Heck, even George McGovern said that. But unfortunately, we can't persuade everyone to try to start a business. So we have to get them in high schools, hence Andrea Rich's charity.
John, Jeff Marston, private business consultant. We all know about Obamacare and what it may do. In research in your book or research in your program, what are some of the other areas in which you see government getting more and more involved in sort of under the radar that we ought to be thinking about?
Every area. I mean, I've been told by someone here that today in the Wall Street Journal, somebody announced that the federal government is requiring all private contractors to hire 7% disabled people. I mean, once these laws for equality exist, they just will constantly grow. I think healthcare is one of the biggest threats. Once they start paying for your healthcare, then they have the right to tell you what you can eat. Then they have the right to have exercise police come into your homes and make you run laps and do push-ups. I mean, clearly healthcare is the big one, because what's going to bankrupt the country first is Medicare. And everybody loves Medicare, especially people our age, and people our age vote. And people don't know that they're getting back 2 to 3 times on average what they paid in, because we rudely refuse to die. And we want all the cool medical stuff that we can get now.
John Herb London. I wonder if you would address the question that's raised by Bill Clinton and Jeffrey Sachs when they continually refer to the fact that the United States is somewhat niggardly in the kind of gifts that we give to foreign nations. We're 14th according to the standard that's used by former President Clinton. But when you look at the private charities that the United States provides, namely the churches, educational institutions, foundations, and the kind of grants that are made to foreign nations, we are by far the most generous nation in the world. Yet that argument is very rarely made, if made at all. I wonder if you'd comment on that.
Well, I think you've answered your own question. It's not true what they say because, and I would add, private individuals give, and all these people go to these countries and do missionary work. And what right does my government have to forcibly take money from me and to have my government give aid money to other countries? So I would say Ron Paul's right. We should cut foreign aid to zero, and the aid should be given by private individuals who freely want to give it. And Americans are uniquely generous that way. I mean, it's sort of funny in that churches tell people to tithe at 10% rates, and Americans are the most generous, but even in America, people don't give 10% of their income. The average is closer to 2 and 3%. In South America and Europe, they give not even a 1%, but Americans are more generous than anybody.
John, Steve Malanga, Manhattan Institute. What you said really is sort of the basis of your book is something that a lot of other thinkers have said, and that's basically that it's not obvious how capitalism or economic freedom leads to the prosperity we have, and that's one of the reasons it's such a hard sell, if you would. Even going all the way back to Bastiat in his essay about the seen and the unseen. But if that's true, why is it that we've had this march towards democracy and capitalism, which not only took hold here in the United States, but from here has spread around the world? And I mean, there are other people who would argue that instead, in fact, this is a kind of natural evolution that goes through smaller cycles of regression, but that in fact it is natural to our way of thinking. How do you respond to that?
I don't think it's natural to our way of thinking, but when you see what other people have, you have to start to say, gee, what are we doing wrong? In communist China, they looked at Hong Kong and saw prosperity, and they said, we should try some experiments. Now, state capitalism gets the credit, but they have diversified greatly. They let each province set its own rules, like in education choice. By and large, the blob, the bureaucracy that resists choice, only increases and becomes more powerful. But once a mother sees Johnny down the street is happy to go to school and likes school and seems to be learning more, she wants what he has. And if he's at a private school or a charter school, that does fight the state. But in the comfortable countries, Europe, United States, the spiderweb of bureaucracy does continue to grow. It's intuitive.
John, Heather McDonald at the Manhattan Institute, you speak about the intuitive appeal of the argument that government can solve our problems. There's another very intuitively appealing argument that's popular these days, which is that growing inequality is a serious problem for society. Do you, agree with the data that shows that that is going on and that there's been stagnation at the lower half of the population? And do you think that it's a problem either to the extent that it's the result of government policies, or what if it was not? What if it simply was the natural result of a capitalist society, that we would have this increasing inequality? Would you say that was a problem?
Well, as a libertarian, I say, no, it's not a problem. If people are free, there will be some who have much more than others. But as a human being, I say it's a problem. It's why they're rioting in Chile. One of the big reasons is income inequality and education inequality. And as a human being, like, I'm annoyed that Joe Rich has more money than I have, you know? I want some. And I should have that. And that's just part of human nature. The statistics in America are woefully misleading in that they show the lowest quintile is stuck there and the highest quintile gets rich. Well, they do that in months when the stock market went up, and then, of course, the people at the top got richer. And the people at the bottom are just as poor, but they're not the same people. They are Oprah Winfrey. They are the welfare mother who's now in the top, but they don't count them that way. They just compare the lowest quintile with the top quintile. And I'm sure you, as a knowledgeable statistician, can tell this better than I, but the numbers are distorted, but it's a real social, political problem because people don't like the disparity.
Sorry. John, James Molinaro, Borough President, Staten Island. I liked what you said about we're wired in such a way that people are always reaching out for something that they want without working for it. We've changed from a country of opportunity to a country of entitlement. We had 5% of families who were single parent in 1960. We have 41% now. As an example, and I'm going to be critical of both parties, Republican and Democratic Party, because they just keep feeding into the system. I come from a borough that's the highest income in the city of New York down the South Shore. And I'm speaking to a teacher down there who's telling me she's speaking to two young ladies that are in high school, and one is telling the other one, I'm going to become pregnant. And the girlfriend says, why? She says, because they'll give me an apartment. And they'll give me $310 a month. And she says, if you ever do, don't get married because they'll stop it. We encourage it. We've been encouraging it for years. And both sides have been encouraging it. And it just keeps increasing and increasing and increasing.
You want to let that woman starve on the street?
Why not? Maybe stop her from having children, period. I don't know what I want, but you can't have parents out there with 4 or 5 children with 4 or 5 different fathers and expect the people surrounding you to support you. And it's got to be loud and clear by both political parties. I saw what happened in New York State with pension reform. When the Republicans only went along with it, because the governor says you want your redistricting, then you go along with this. That's the problem.
Let John respond. See what he has.
Well, in America, we're not going to let people starve in the streets, and there's no need for it. I mean, before we had the giant social welfare bureaucracy we had now, nobody starved in this, practically no one starved in the streets then, because we had thousands of mutual aid societies all over the country. Private charities did this better, and they were better at saying to that woman who was getting pregnant just because she'd get free stuff that, no, we're not going to take care of you for that, and you better not. But they were basically not overtly driven out of business by the welfare state, but people said, I don't need to do this anymore. The government will do that, and government does it clumsily and badly.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up because I think there's a car waiting for you. But thank you, John, and good luck with the tour.